Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Reddit. What is the most eerie thing that's ever happened to you? Story 1. Shotgun Trap.
I am a medic and firefighter, and one call I responded to still sends chills down my spine. It started as something seemingly routine, a report of chest pain. The caller mentioned he was in his barn or garage, which is not unusual in the rural areas we serve. When we arrived on the scene, though, something felt off. I could not explain it, but my instincts were screaming that something was not right. There was no visible threat, no obvious reason to hesitate, yet a sense of unease gripped me. Following my training and gut feeling, I decided to do a 360-degree assessment of the building before we approached the front door, which was clearly the main entrance. As I rounded the side of the structure, I came across a window. Curious and cautious, I looked inside. What I saw froze me in my tracks. There was a shotgun rigged to the front door, set as a booby trap for anyone entering. Nearby, I spotted the man who had called us, but it was too late to help him. He had taken his own life and was hanging lifelessly in the barn. Realizing the imminent danger to my team and me, I quickly alerted everyone. We decided to breach the building through a safer route, breaking through a plexiglass-like material on the side. Once inside, we confirmed what I had seen from the window. Sadly, there was nothing we could do for the man. He was already beyond help. As I stood there, the weight of the moment hit me. Had I ignored my instincts and gone through the front door, I would have been the first to face that shotgun. For reasons I cannot explain, I hesitated that day, and it may have saved my life. Even now, I cannot shake the eerie feeling that something or someone was looking out for me.
Story 2. Intruder in the Darkness.
My ex-partner and I lived in a remote part of northern Nevada. Our house stood alone in the middle of a vast field, with the nearest neighbors far away. It was the kind of isolation that made the nights feel darker and quieter than anywhere else. And I never felt entirely at ease, especially when he worked late shifts. One night, while he was working, I drifted off to sleep. As I slept, I had an unsettling dream. In it, he was standing on the edge of a cliff similar to the Grand Canyon, gazing silently at the vast expanse before him. I called out to him repeatedly, trying to catch his attention, but he ignored me, his eyes fixed ahead. Then, without warning, he turned sharply, grabbed my arms firmly, and looked directly into my eyes. His face was pale, filled with panic. As he said, "There is somebody in the house." The words jolted me awake like a shot. My eyes flew open, my heart pounding. The room was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that felt too heavy, too unnatural. Every hair on my body stood on end. As I lay there, straining to hear even the faintest sound, my dog suddenly leapt to attention. He barked furiously and bolted through his dog door into the yard. My stomach dropped. What had he heard? Frozen in bed, I listened intently, my imagination conjuring up every possible scenario. I thought about the dream, about my ex's panicked warning, and wondered if it had been more than just my mind playing tricks on me. After what felt like an eternity, the dog returned. He trotted back inside, calm as if nothing had happened, and curled up to sleep. But I could not shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my thoughts racing. I never saw or heard anything unusual that night, but the memory of the dream and the dog's reaction still haunts me. It felt as if some invisible presence had tried to warn me of what I may never know.
Story 3. Phantom Soldiers.
Years ago, I worked the late shift at a hospital from 4 p.m. to midnight. My nightly drive home took me through back roads surrounded by fields and woods, often shrouded in low-hanging fog, especially during early spring. I lived in a small town steeped in Civil War history. Ghost stories were so prevalent that local historians frequently conducted moonlit ghost walks, searching for evidence of restless spirits roaming the battlefield. According to urban legend, soldiers killed by family members during the war were doomed to wander forever, unable to find peace. I never put much stock in these tales, but one foggy night, I experienced something that shook me to my core. At around 1 a.m., as I navigated the winding roads, I noticed the silhouettes of 2 figures walking along the roadside. The dense fog made it difficult to see, so I slowed down to avoid hitting them. By the time I passed, I was creeping along at just 10 miles per hour. As my headlights illuminated them, I noticed their peculiar hats and the buttons on their jackets glinting in the light. I could hardly believe my eyes. They looked like Civil War soldiers walking through the fog in the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat. The taller of the 2, a thin and gangly figure, turned toward my car and extended his hand. Panic surged through me. I pressed the gas pedal as hard as I could, and my car lurched forward, the transmission barely keeping up. When I finally caught my breath, I let out a scream, overwhelmed by the eerie encounter. Just as I rounded another curve, I spotted a small car. A Geo Metro pulled over with its hazard lights flashing. Steam rose from under its hood. Standing beside the car was a man dressed in Civil War attire, hands on his hips, staring at the engine in frustration. It turned out reenactors were in town for an event and had car trouble. I still have no idea why they were wandering so late at night, but that moment nearly scared me to death.
Story 4. Woman in My Closet.
I have had 2 episodes in my life, but the first one will stick with me forever. My bed was positioned in a corner of my room. The closet was in the opposite corner. There was no door on the closet, and it was stacked with a lot of junk. It served as a shared storage space for the household, as I never used it. I woke up lying on my back with the door in my line of sight. I could see that it was full, but I also saw a hand slowly slide out and grip the door frame. It was pale and feminine. Following that, the figure of a very tall woman slowly emerged from the closet, clad in a white, Victorian-era dress. She was almost beautiful, aside from something about her face that just wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I remember feeling uneasy. For what felt like about 15 minutes, she just stood there, muttering to herself. I couldn't make out any of her words, but that's when the panic set in. I realized I couldn't move or speak, and I couldn't look away. I felt fully awake, but I had no idea what was happening. Then she stopped. She looked me in the eye, smiled, and the corners of her mouth stretched back to her ears. It was terrifying. She began to approach me and slowly opened her mouth so wide that her chin nearly touched what I estimated to be the bottom of her rib cage. It wasn't long before I could smell her rotten breath, and she started to crawl on top of me. Throughout the ordeal, she let out a horrifying, multi-toned moan that sounded like 5 voices at once, all distorted and unearthly. I could feel her weight resting heavily on my chest. I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't scream as she inched closer. She put my entire head in her mouth, and I fully woke up when all I could see was darkness. I still get a bit panicked remembering that one. It felt so real.
Story 5. Consumed by the light.
This is a weird one. I know how it's going to sound, but I am going to share it anyway, since I have never really told this story to anyone but my closest friends for obvious reason. Sorry, it's going to be long. In 2010, there were 2 supermoons and 2 lunar eclipses in the same year. I was out at the edge of the Puget Sound in Seattle at a place called Carkeek Park with a friend, waiting to see the second of the supermoons. There were actually a lot of people there waiting to see the moon rise over the horizon in the upper parking lot, since it was high ground and folks were loud and partying. My friend and I walked down to the beach to get a little more space and quiet. I remember hearing people literally applaud as the moon rose behind us, though we could not yet see it from our vantage point. The waters started responding with sudden, strong, short, repeating waves after being nearly still moments before. The waves got so intense we had to stand up and move back. Just then I saw this huge golden light appear to rise from the water in front of us far off in the distance. I assumed I was seeing the reflection of the moon and turned around to look at the moon directly. It was so bright I was blinking my eyes. I turned back toward the water, and what I thought were lights in my vision turned out to be 2 hovering, dancing, golden, shimmering objects flying above us. Just above the area I thought I saw the water illuminate. These 2 flying objects hovered, then danced figure 8s, then flew from right to left with abrupt stops in between. The crowd in the parking lot saw them too and started cheering and yelling things like, "Extraterrestrial, phone home." Then the objects changed colours from gold to red and back to gold again in unison. The 2 objects then flew toward each other with what felt like great force and just kind of became one object with a brighter light. They didn't crash. They just merged into one, silently. As this light grew, I noticed the sound of the cheering people was starting to fade away, and I felt a pressure begin to build in my ears. I didn't hear voices or anything, but I felt consumed by this feeling that everything was going to be okay, like a warmth had just washed over me. I can't explain it, but it was like I knew I needed to let go. It didn't feel like I was going to die per se. At least there was no fear, but I knew I needed to let go. I looked at my friend, who was staring at with a concerned face, and back toward the light. I stared at the light until it consumed my vision completely, and I felt almost in a meditative state. It felt like nothing else existed. I remember taking a deep breath and hearing the sound of myself breathing out. In what felt like an instant later, I came to. I was standing on top of a picnic table in a different park that I knew was nearly 2 miles away. My friend was pleading with me to get down. I asked her how we got there and why I was up on the table. She said, all of a sudden, while we were looking at the bright light, I suddenly started acting childlike and even speaking in a slightly different voice. She said moments after she noticed a change in me, The light from the flying objects just faded away from view slowly. Right after that, I took off running down the beach, laughing like a little kid. She said I was running and climbing over rocks and things along the way like a dog that had been let off the leash for the first time. She chased after me and basically babysat me for a couple of hours. Didn't believe in cell phones back then, so I had no way to call for help. I had left my flip phone in my car back at the parking lot. My friend explained that during this weird episode, at some point she had yelled, "Come back." She said I stopped, turned to her, and very seriously. That obviously scared the heck out of her. So she just kept following me at a distance until I got to that park and climbed up on the table and started dancing with my arms up in the air. I want to make it clear that I am no more of a runner than I am someone who would dance on a table. I hate attention. I don't drink. I would never make a scene like this ever. And luckily my friend had known me for well over a decade and knew that too. She said when she finally caught up with me, I was dancing and waving my arms and then abruptly stopped and was totally silent. And still for a few seconds before sounding like myself again and saying, "How did we get here?" When I asked if she had seen those objects flying on the beach, she said yes and retold the whole story just as I remembered it, until the moment I was consumed by the light and wound up across town. We eventually walked back to our cars and decided to go back to her place to stay the night, since neither of us wanted to be alone after that. We never made sense of what happened that night. A few weeks later, I got a concussion in an unrelated accident and had extensive brain imaging and testing done. Had the supermoon event been due to a brain-related issue, I would have found out then. I know a literal crowd full of people at Karkik Park saw those objects.
Story 6. Mysterious Night in Tajikistan.
I went to Tajikistan in 2019 to meet my new colleagues and learn the area where I was to be working. I was greeted by my employer and a few of my new colleagues at the airport, and they took me to an apartment complex where everyone was housed. Every building looked dull and dusty on the outside. Upon entering, I could see hallways with tile flooring and metal staircases leading to each apartment. The apartments had heavy metal doors. I couldn't decide if I felt safe because everything looked secure, or uneasy because I wondered why everything needed to be so secure. We walked up to the 3rd floor and entered the door on that landing. As I walked in, I was shocked. The floor was covered in immaculately detailed rugs, beautiful wallpaper with sparkling gold, plum and emerald-colored designs, massive crystal chandeliers, and beautiful antique furniture. It felt like I had just walked into an underground palace. There were 2 women who took my things, showed me to my room, and offered me tea, cake, and a variety of snacks. Everyone was so kind and welcoming. It was around 6 p.m. and the women had prepared dinner for everyone. I was the only female in the group of colleagues. We were ushered into the dining room, which had a long table close to the floor, surrounded by big, beautiful floor pillows. We ate, laughed, and had a good conversation. When it was bedtime, one of the ladies brought towels and toiletries to my room and let me get settled in. She told me to lock my door, which I would have done regardless. The doors to the rooms were also heavy metal doors with large sliding locks on them. After I freshened up, I got into my pajamas and went to bed to call my husband. We talked for about an hour before I started falling asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night with my phone in my hand. I could hear someone singing. I didn't understand the words, but it sounded sad. It made my hair stand up on end. It sounded far away. I got out of bed to look out the window. In the distance was a mountain range with faint lighting behind it, as if the moon was setting behind it. The singing was coming from the mountains. It was both beautiful and eerily terrifying. I lost track of time, not even sure how long I was standing at the window. I asked about it the next morning at breakfast, and everyone just kind of looked at each other. They never gave me an explanation. They just said some things here are ancient. I'll never forget that experience.
Story 7. Noises from the attic.
When I was between 12 and 15 years old, I found myself alone one evening in our house. I was sitting in the den, focused on my computer, with no one else at home. Directly across from me was the door that led to the pantry, which had a set of stairs that took you to the attic. The attic was always a mysterious, dark place, one that I rarely ventured into. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a loud thump followed by another. And then a series of thuds, like something was falling down the stairs. My heart froze in my chest. There was a door at the top of the stairs that shouldn't have allowed anything to fall, let alone make such a noise. I got up, my legs shaking with fear. I made my way to the door, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the knob. My hand hovered above it, but something kept me from opening it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and just as I was about to back away, I heard the unmistakable sound of something pacing above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps dragging across the floor above, as if whatever it was had been waiting for me to notice. I slowly retreated, heart pounding in my ears, and curled up on the couch in the den, trying to keep my eyes on the door. The thumping continued, more pronounced now, and it felt like it was getting closer. Each thud was followed by the sound of something dragging down the stairs, as if whatever was up there was making its way closer and closer to me. Time seemed to stretch on for hours. I sat in the darkness, barely breathing, my eyes locked on the door. I was terrified, not knowing if I should stay put or run, but something in me told me I shouldn't move. I waited, frozen in fear, until finally, just before my parents arrived home, the noises stopped. It was like they had vanished into thin air. When my dad arrived home, I barely said a word about it. I didn't want to sound crazy. But he went up to check the attic, and when he came down, he confirmed that nothing had been moved. No sign of anything falling, no disturbances. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. But it was real. I knew what I heard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still up there in the attic, just waiting for the next moment I was alone. After that night, I couldn't bear to be alone in the house. It was the same place where I wouldn't even take a shower if no one else was home. I always felt like something was watching me, following me. I never could explain it, but I never forgot the sounds, the pacing, and that overwhelming sense of dread. And as if things weren't strange enough, the house we moved into after that one, it was worse.
Story 8. Disappearing stranger.
Since this question has come up multiple times, I'll start by explaining why I never showered alone at the house. We lived in a very old house, and in the bathroom, there were two older medicine cabinets. They were the type that you pushed closed, and they would latch. They were incredibly difficult to open, and you had to really pull on them. They would not open on their own. Trust me on that. One night, when I was around 12 or 13 years old, I was home alone and decided to take a shower. As usual, I made sure to push the medicine cabinets tightly closed, as I have always hated mirrors facing me. After I hopped into the shower, I had only been in for a few minutes when I heard the sound of creaking, which rose above the sound of the running water. I peeked out, and to my horror, I saw that one of the cabinets had opened, and the mirror was now facing me. In the reflection, I saw the face of a dark, shadowed man. I screamed, scrambled out of the shower, grabbed my towel, and ran into the living room, shaking with fear until my parents came home. Of course, they didn't believe me. They thought I must have imagined it, but I knew what I saw. After that night, I never showered alone in that house again. Shortly before I turned 16, we moved into a basement apartment. It was very old, and honestly, it was as creepy as could be. I hated living there and never felt comfortable. One of the first nights we were there, I was in my bedroom, supposed to be asleep. The closet had those rolling doors, and I had made sure to close them tightly. Just like mirrors, closets always made me uneasy. Then one side of the closet door slowly began to creak open. I was frozen in terror, not knowing what to do. And then a hand, just a hand, with no body, pushed the door open. There was no one else there, just the hand and a black shadow in the corner. This was the same house where, semi-routinely, things would move when we hadn't touched them. Shadows rarely seemed like just shadows, and I would often wake up to see a man standing in the doorway of whatever room I was in. We also fostered kittens there, and they would suddenly stop everything and watch things that weren't there, their little heads turning to follow movements that couldn't be explained. One eerie experience happened when we went on a vacation to the southern side of the state. We stopped at a valley viewing spot. I was with my mom and two friends, and we were sitting on a ledge, talking and joking when I noticed a man in the distance. He was about half a mile away, leaning against a fence. He caught my eye because he was the only other person nearby, but when I looked at him again, I saw that he was dressed in clothes that seemed old-fashioned, more Western than what you'd typically see nowadays. I glanced away to point him out to one of my friends, but when I looked back, he was gone, just gone. There was nowhere for him to have gone. He couldn't have stepped behind anything or disappeared into a building. There was nowhere for him to hide. Later that evening, when we sat down for dinner, one of my friends brought up the man. We realized that each of us had noticed him at different times, and we could all describe him perfectly. However, after that first look, he had vanished without a trace. It was a truly shocking moment, and it was the first time I had ever seen a full apparition when I wasn't alone.
Story 9. Blood Moon.
A friend and I decided to go to a diner for a late-night meal. We were both at home, and one of us texted the other to see if they wanted to come eat. I ended up driving, picked up my friend, and we went to a diner in Fort Lee, New Jersey. We chose this particular diner because my friend was friends with someone who used to work there. Anyways, we both were disappointed with our food. It was poorly made by New Jersey diner standards. Neither of us finished our meals and decided to head home. While driving, I got distracted by our conversation on how bad the food was and made a right turn too early. I turned into Route 4 when I wanted Route 46 instead. Since we were in no rush, neither of us thought it was a big deal. I saw an exit for Grand Avenue, which is where we wanted to go from Route 46, so I took it. It didn't take us where we were expecting, though. I thought maybe if we kept driving, we would eventually pass through a part of Grand Avenue we recognized. We quickly realized we were in an odd place. I say this because we were driving through the woods. This part of New Jersey is right outside of New York City, and it's very developed. As we were driving, we saw an abandoned car to the left of us. The car didn't look old or beat up. We were questioning why someone would leave their car there when suddenly we saw a police car up ahead. I figured we would go up to the officer and ask for directions or at least find out where we were. As we approached the police car, we noticed that all its lights were on and the driver's side door was open. We saw no one around us and started seriously wondering what was going on. The road up ahead curved, and the trees blocked our view of what was ahead. I saw a red light coming through the trees and figured we were close to civilization again. After finishing the curve, I realized that the red light was coming from the moon. This was no ordinary moon. It covered the entire sky. It was so close that you could easily see all the craters. They were filled with what appeared to be blood. Some of them appeared to be overflowing with blood, leading to rivers of blood. The best way I can describe it is to imagine a volcano spewing blood. I was watching all of this while driving in silence. I told myself that my food must have been drugged or that I was having a mental breakdown. I convinced myself that I wasn't going to mention what I was seeing, drop my friend off at his home, and then drive myself to the hospital. As I observed the bloody moon, which appeared so close that it seemed it would crash into the earth, I wondered what was wrong with me. After several minutes of silence, my friend said to me, "We're going to die." I asked him why he would say that, and he looked at me and said, "Don't you see the moon? It's covered in blood, and it's going to crash and kill us all. Believe it or not." When he said this, I felt a huge sense of relief because at least I wasn't hallucinating. We both couldn't be seeing the same hallucination at the same time. I told him the truth about why I stayed silent when I saw it. I described what I saw, and he pointed out various parts of the moon. We both quickly came to the conclusion that we were looking at the same thing. Oddly enough, we were calm. I explained that I didn't believe we were actually looking at the moon because if it was truly as close as it appeared, we would experience its gravitational effect. We both agreed that death was at hand. Some time passed, and the road had another steep curve. The trees blocked out the sky, and the red light from the moon continued to shine through them. After driving through the curve, the woods abruptly ended. I stopped the car, and we both looked behind us. The bloody moon was gone. I told my friend that this didn't make sense, and we needed to go back into the woods. He refused and demanded to be dropped off at his home. I dropped him off and duplicated the drive I made earlier to get back to the moon. I couldn't even find the woods again. The exit to Grand Avenue didn't lead to the same place as before. For the next several days I drove around and went through Yahoo Maps and MapQuest to try to find the woods. But I could not find anything close enough to be a candidate. We both talk about it to this day and try to find some meaning in it. My friend was more open to people about what he saw than I was, and people tended to think he was crazy or super religious. I stayed relatively silent since I knew no one would believe me.
Story 10. Creepy truth behind the Nevada weapons depot.
I worked at a nuclear weapons storage depot in the Nevada desert outside Nellis Air Force Base for 6 years. It is now shut down. When people say unidentified flying objects, UFOs, are attracted to nuclear weapons, they are telling the truth. But much more happens than you might expect. My first night there, I witnessed a ball of light trigger a sensor on the fence line, prompting a security response. The ball was chased by 3 patrols as it flew directly above the fence line before finally taking a sharp turn out into the desert. Over the course of 2 weeks, we discovered 3 mutilated donkeys, each located about a mile apart from one another, and seemingly dropped off out of nowhere. There were no tracks in or out. Various organs had been removed from each donkey, and there was no blood anywhere, only clean cuts with no tears in the flesh. Scavengers hadn't even touched the bodies. I witnessed a figure standing atop the roof of a structure just 30 meters from me and 14 other personnel. It was simply standing there watching us. I took a spotlight and shined it up there, and as soon as the light hit the figure, it disappeared. We all saw it happen. I once heard a man laughing maniacally, but there was nothing there. A sweep with night vision and thermal cameras revealed nothing, and 3 other witnesses were present. We wrote it off as the Laughing Colonel, an urban legend passed down among the security personnel over the years, while on patrol in an adjoining conventional weapons storage area. My partner and I parked next to a hot pad loaded with 500-pound bombs that were about to be shipped overseas. We heard a soft cooing sound coming from the pad. My partner and I conducted a security sweep of the pad, but the cooing continued, seemingly luring us past the pad and into the pitch-black desert. Night vision and thermal cameras revealed nothing. We chose not to pursue and just did another sweep of the pad and moved along. While on a training exercise, our machine gun overwatch team spotted 2 figures on thermal cameras in the desert behind us. The exercise was immediately cancelled when the head of security stated that he hadn't placed any enemy combatants out there. Everyone was ordered to lock and load, and a sweep was set up. The overwatch team observed the figures going prone and backing away from our sweep element, only to disappear as we got close. Our thermal cameras confirmed trace heat on the ground, despite us not seeing anything during the sweep. The strangest event occurred when I was on exterior patrol, outside the fence line. I received a call to respond to a truck approaching from the side of a nearby mountain. It wasn't unusual, as most people didn't know we were out there, and we often caught trespassers. I visually confirmed the truck using night vision goggles, and then suddenly the headlights disappeared. We assumed the driver had turned off the lights and was now approaching on foot. We called for a K9 unit and moved into a blocking position, knowing that anyone would have to cross past us to approach the perimeter. We were there for about 10 minutes when, one by one, the patrol members overseeing us from high points inside the perimeter called in lights, appearing at our 12, 3 and 9 o'clock positions, effectively flanking us, with the fence line about 300 meters behind us. We saw and heard nothing, not even on night vision goggles or thermal cameras. The K9 unit never reacted. Suddenly, a panic patrol called in that the lights were rushing toward us. We were already locked and loaded, and I told my partner to load a grenade into the launcher. Nothing happened. The K9 unit still didn't react. Our radios died, and after 10 minutes, we hiked back to the fence line. Only then did we discover that we had been out of contact for twice as long as I thought. This is a very paraphrased account of the event, as I'm relaying it over the phone. But I want to highlight that our radios only started working when we were back at the fence line. There is more to the story, but these are the key events I am allowed to speak about. The world is not as normal as you believe it is.
Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare.